the high summer of 1940, the fate of Britain rose into the sky. Each morning, radar screens flickered to life, telephones rang, young men pulled on flying helmets and ran for their aircraft, knowing that in a matter of minutes they might be burned, broken, or gone entirely. Above them, contrails tangled like chalk lines across the blue, the visible traces of a battle that would decide whether an island would stand or fall. This is episode 17 of our long-form journey through the Second World War. In our last episode, we followed the opening phase of the Battle of Britain, the struggle over the Channel, the brutal learning curve in the air, and the quiet systems of radar, production, and command that kept Fighter Command alive when it should have been overwhelmed. Tonight, that struggle reaches its breaking point. We move through burning airfields and fractured command rooms, rival theories of how to fight a modern air war, and the moment a single navigational error pulled London itself into the crosshairs. It is a story of exhaustion and endurance, of miscalculation at the highest levels, and of a nation pushed to the edge, then given just enough room to breathe. I've shaped this episode to carry you gently as the day fades, letting the noise of the world fall away while the tension of history unfolds at its own steady pace. If these episodes bring you comfort, a like and a subscription help more than you know, and I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from tonight. Take a slow breath and let's begin. The summer of 1940 had not unfolded as the Reich Marshal had envisioned it. Hermann Göring arrived at Cap Gris-Nez on the 21st of August, carrying something heavier than the weight of command. He carried frustration, the particular slow-burning kind that takes hold of a man who has pledged swift and decisive victory and found instead a situation that resists his predictions at every turn. As Reich Marshal of the Luftwaffe, he was not a figure accustomed to explaining shortfalls, and he had not crossed into northern France with any intention of beginning that practice now. His inspection tour of the bomber and fighter units stationed along the northern French coastline was, in its outward form, a display of rank and unquestioned authority. Göring moved through the assembled men with the settled bearing of someone who believed himself equal to whatever demands history might bring. But the words he had carried across the Channel were far from warm. In the weeks before this visit, he had offered his aviators something approaching genuine praise, admiration for what they had endured through months of relentless aerial combat. Now, standing before them under the August sky, he arrived in an entirely different register. The carrot had been set aside. The stick arrived in its place, wielded without apology. The campaign against Britain was falling behind schedule. His intelligence officers had reported more than once the near annihilation of the Royal Air Force, and yet each time those reports arrived, fresh squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes appeared from somewhere to rise against his bombers with a persistence that defied explanation. Where were these aircraft coming from? Why were the factories producing the enemy's replacements still standing and operating? The questions accumulated without resolution, and beneath each one lay an increasingly uncomfortable truth. The timetable for destroying Britain's war-making capacity was slipping. Operation Sea Lion, the carefully constructed plan for the invasion of the island kingdom, would have to be postponed once more. Göring directed his frustration at the men before him with little restraint. His language was severe, and certain words, among them an accusation of cowardice, fell upon pilots already eroded by weeks of relentless operational flying. The bolder among them refused to absorb the criticism in silence. Adolf Galland was foremost among those who answered back, defending himself with the conviction of someone who harbored no doubt about his record in the air. The resentment filling the room was real, and Göring felt it. He understood his pilots at a level beneath formal rank. The heat he drove into them cut through their exhaustion and brought something essential back toward the surface. The instincts of fighting men, dulled by fatigue but still present, began to stir again. What came next, he told them, would be of a different order. Beginning on the 24th of August, just 3 days hence, Phase 2 of the Luftwaffe's operational campaign would begin. Massive formations of bombers, each covered by strong fighter escorts, would strike the RAF's ground installations, its fuel reserves, its aircraft factories, and the repair depots keeping its machines in the air. The attacks would press forward without pause through daylight and into night. His objective was absolute: the complete elimination of British air power as a functioning force. The enemy's fighters were to be drawn into open battle through the unceasing weight of attack and, once exposed, destroyed. Before returning to Germany, he made a final stop. At the observation post on the heights of Cap Gris-Nez, Göring stood in the fading afternoon light and raised powerful binoculars toward the chalk cliffs of Dover visible across the narrow channel. England was there, pale and still, the white cliffs catching the last of the light, close enough to seem almost reachable. He remained at the post for some time without speaking, and those who had come with him waited nearby in silence. One member of the party would recall the moment in later years with quiet precision. Standing at that height above the water, the Reich Marshal had seemed to be attempting something no optical glass could achieve, pressing past the stone and the open water, reaching somehow toward the minds of the adversaries waiting on the far side. What he held with certainty and what he kept at distance in that long, still interval, not one of those present could say. He lowered the binoculars eventually and turned from the water, offering nothing. The cliffs of Dover remained exactly as they had always been, still, luminous, and entirely unmoved by the attention they had received. Had Göring been able to see past those white cliffs that afternoon, had some impossible clarity allowed him to look inside the RAF's fighter command, what he found there would have brought him considerable relief. The picture developing behind the chalk facade of the English coast was a troubled one, and its nature was quite different from what his intelligence reports suggested. Fighter Command's most pressing difficulty was a human one. The aircraft themselves were, in relative terms, holding. Production lines had kept pace well enough that, despite losses accumulated since the 8th of August, more than 270 machines shot down, damaged beyond repair, or destroyed on the ground, Fighter Command could still put close to 700 fighters into the air. The planes were present. What was becoming critically dangerously scarce was the element no factory could replace: the experienced men to fly them. Since August the 8th, 94 RAF pilots had been killed or reported missing. Another 60 had been hospitalized, removed from the rotation by wounds or burns too serious to allow their return. These were trained aviators whose worth could not be measured in production schedules. Each one who disappeared from the rota left a gap that a willing volunteer, however eager, could only partially fill. Air Chief Marshal Dowding and his group commanders drew upon every resource available. Pilots were arriving from overseas, men drawn by the conviction that the outcome of this struggle mattered enough to die for. One full squadron was composed entirely of Canadians. Others had been reinforced by Polish and Czech aviators who had escaped their occupied homelands, carrying something that no training could manufacture. The Canadians brought a bold, swaggering energy. The Poles and Czechs flew with a driven intensity rooted in something deeper. Families and homes left somewhere behind the lines of a continent now largely held by Germany, unreachable and unknown. Willingness and capability, however, were pulling in separate directions. These newer pilots, however fierce in their commitment, were still developing the instincts that combat over the Channel demanded. The capacity to judge a pursuit angle in a fraction of a second, to manage altitude and fuel under fire, to know when to press and when to break away. These were lessons only survival could teach. Volunteers tended toward risk in ways that more seasoned men had learned to restrain. A pilot who had emerged from 50 engagements intact was worth 2 or 3 who had come through 5, and the RAF supply of veterans was thinning at a rate that alarmed those who studied the figures. A second difficulty lay within Dowding's own command structure, a rupture that had grown steadily more damaging as the battle deepened. His 2 senior group commanders, Air Vice Marshals Keith Park and Trafford Lee Mallory, had arrived at a state of open antagonism. Park held command of 11 Group, responsible for the defence of southeastern England, the corridor of sky through which every major Luftwaffe assault was channeled. Leigh Mallory commanded 12 Group to the north, its primary task the protection of England's industrial Midlands, a region the Luftwaffe had so far left largely untouched. The tension between them was sharpened by ambition. Dowding was 57 years old, and there were those within the Air Ministry who had quietly concluded he had grown too old for his position. He remained in command largely at the Prime Minister's insistence. Lee Mallory had studied the situation and reached his own conclusions. The path toward Dowding's post ran, he believed, through a conspicuous battlefield victory, one achievable only if 12 Group was permitted to fight, and fight prominently. As he understood it, the current arrangement denied his squadrons that opportunity. The Luftwaffe had concentrated almost entirely in the south within Park's territory. Park, with Dowding's full endorsement, had proposed that 12 Group's less pressured squadrons might cover 11 Group's airfields while Park's pilots engaged the enemy over the Channel. Leigh Mallory dismissed the proposal with visible impatience. Guided by his most assertive pilot, Douglas Bader, he directed his forces into Park's operational area in pursuit of independent offensive engagements instead. The consequence was predictable and recurring. When Park urgently needed 12 Group's aircraft over his threatened airfields, they were reliably somewhere else, following priorities of their own. The 2 commanders held fundamentally different ideas about the nature of the battle. And in the airspace above southern England, those competing convictions were already beginning to exact a price. The morning of Saturday, August the 24th arrived clear and fine, the kind of late summer day that in peacetime would have drawn people out of doors and into the warmth of the season. By 9 o'clock, more than 100 Luftwaffe bombers and fighters were crossing toward 11 groups' airfields, and the ease of the August morning was long since irrelevant. The first target was Manston, positioned close to the coast near Dover. The attack came in with speed and deliberate thoroughness. Bomb craters opened across the runways in rapid succession. Buildings that had stood for years collapsed or burned. Telephone and teleprinter lines were severed, cutting the station from the communications network that held the defense system together. The damage was so complete that Manston could no longer function as an operational base. It was permanently abandoned. Ramsgate Airfield on the Thames estuary was struck as well, and bombs intended for aeronautical targets fell among surrounding houses and their residents. Further inland, 2 fighter command sector stations, North Weald and Hornchurch, absorbed heavy damage. These were not merely airfields, they were the nerve centers that controlled and directed RAF pilots once they were airborne. An appeal went to 12 Group. 2 squadrons arrived from Duxford, too late to effect what had already been done. The days that followed brought complications the RAF had not previously encountered in quite this form. Luftwaffe formations began flying continuously along the French coastline through the daylight hours, staying just within range of British radar. The plotters at their instruments had no reliable way to determine which formation was genuinely building toward a channel crossing and which was circling to deceive. The psychological weight of sustained, unresolvable uncertainty, perpetual readiness without the knowledge of when the blow would land, was its own form of attrition. With the ungainly Stukas withdrawn following earlier losses, the German bombing effort fell increasingly to Junkers, 88s and Dorniers pressing well inland, reaching targets on the outskirts of London, fighter commands, sector stations, aircraft factories and repair facilities. Messerschmitt 110s, some carrying their own bomb loads, added further weight to the assault. RAF pilots returning from engagements overhead found with deepening frequency that the airfields they needed to land on had been worked over in their absence. Runways cratered, buildings destroyed, the ground itself transformed into something hostile. Park had moved past requesting assistance from Lee Mallory. He was demanding it. Dowding issued a direct order. 12 Group was required to provide protective patrols over 11 Group's threatened bases. Leigh Mallory gave his reluctant assent, and then, with a frequency that rendered the assent nearly meaningless, his fighters arrived only after the Luftwaffe's damage had already been done. The main energies of 12 Group were directed elsewhere. With Lee Mallory's encouragement, Douglas Bader was engaged in a sustained experiment, assembling 5 or more squadrons into a single large formation, a big wing, and sending this concentration against the Luftwaffe's returning groups. The results were partially satisfying when big wings intercepted enemy formations heading back across the channel. But assembling a big wing required time, and time was precisely what the situation could not supply. By the time the formation reached operational height, the enemy had come and gone. The bombs had already fallen. At a conference called urgently at Bentley Priory, Dowding brought the 2 men into the same room. The bitterness between Park and Lee Mallory was immediate and undisguised. They fell into an argument over the big wing's approach, an argument that was, at its core, about 2 entirely different understandings of what the battle required. Leigh Mallory held that destroying the enemy's bombers was the priority, and that timing and location were secondary. Park held that the bombers had to be stopped before they reached their targets, that sector stations reduced to rubble and factories stripped of their roofs served no one, regardless of how many German aircraft were shot down on the way home. Dowding closed the discussion with a grimness that reflected everything the maps and loss reports on his desk were telling him. The debate about tactics, he reminded his commanders, was continuing while the strategic situation deteriorated. Fighter command was now 200 pilots short. Those still flying were approaching the outer limit of what sustained pressure allows a person to endure. The RAF had inflicted more losses on the Luftwaffe than it had absorbed every day so far, but that margin was narrowing, and it could reverse without warning. The margin reversed on the 31st of August. Wave after wave of German bombers moved against southeastern England that morning with a force that the strained squadrons of Fighter Command were hard-pressed to absorb. The airfields of the region took the most concentrated punishment the Luftwaffe had yet delivered in a single day. Landing grounds that had endured through the earlier phases were reduced to cratered, unlandable surfaces. Hangars burned. Operational buildings were razed to their foundations. Power cables were severed. Aircraft were caught on the ground before their pilots could reach them. Ground personnel, mechanics, controllers, wireless operators, the invisible labor that sustained the entire air defense system, were killed at their posts. By the time the raid ceased and darkness returned to the airfields of southeastern England, Fighter Command had lost 39 aircraft and 14 pilots, the heaviest casualties of any single day since the battle began. And for the first time since the fighting had started, the RAF had lost more aircraft than the Luftwaffe over the course of a day's engagement. The long, precarious balance that had kept the defenders ahead, always costly, always fragile, had at last been overturned. The damage extended beyond what single figures could capture. Strikes against aircraft manufacturing plants had slowed production measurably. Losses were outpacing the rate at which replacements could be readied. Machines were going down faster than factories could return them to service. The repair pipeline, never simple to manage under pressure, was beginning to seize. The infrastructure of Fighter Command, its bases, communications networks, supply lines, had absorbed a degree of punishment that would take days to begin addressing and far longer to fully repair. After only 1 week of Phase 2, the Luftwaffe's new strategy was performing beyond what even Göring had allowed himself to anticipate. In Berlin, the atmosphere among German military planners in those early September days was one of barely contained exhilaration. American correspondents reported the mood with astonishment. Uniformed men spoke openly of victory, of German flags flying over London within days. On the 1st of September, senior figures were predicting Operation Sea Lion would be launched within 4 days. 2 days later, Hitler formally scheduled the invasion for the 21st of September. The machinery of conquest was advancing with the confidence of a foregone conclusion. For Hugh Dowding, the picture offered no consolation. The losses in experienced pilots pressed upon him more heavily than the aircraft figures. Machines could, in time, be replaced by machines. Pilots could be replaced only by other pilots, and the men filling the gaps were younger, less tested, and flying closer to the edge of what sustained operational pressure allows a person to endure. Every morning's report brought him the same trajectory, only steeper. He had spent his professional life in the conviction that Britain's air defence was achievable, and he had built the system meant to make it so. The radar chain, the sector stations, the integrated communications network, the careful management of resources that had allowed Fighter Command to remain in the fight through weeks that should, by any honest calculation, have broken it. The system was still standing. Its fractures were becoming visible, and the force being applied to it was increasing every day. Dowding was a man of genuine religious conviction, and it may have been this quality that allowed him to hold his deepest anxiety at some distance from the decisions he was required to make. That belief was being tested now with a severity it had never previously encountered. In a moment of private reflection, a rare admission from a man who maintained his composure as a matter of professional necessity, he gave voice to what the situation had driven him toward. What Fighter Command required, he said quietly, was a miracle. He had no way of knowing, as those words left him, that the miracle had already taken place. It had happened a week before, in the darkness above England on the night of August the 24th, in a pair of cockpits above a city that both sides had agreed, in their different ways, to leave alone. Two pilots had made an error, the kind of ordinary human mistake that tired men under pressure occasionally make, and in doing so had set in motion a sequence of events whose consequences would reach far beyond anything the two of them could have imagined as they turned east and ran for home. There was one boundary that Göring had drawn with particular care when assembling the orders for Phase 2. His commanders had been given broad operational latitude. They could strike by day and by night. They could range across Britain pursuing the RAF's airfields, supply infrastructure, manufacturing capacity, and fuel installations. The map of approved targets was extensive, and the freedom to act across it was genuine. A single exception had been made, one clearly defined exclusion resting on Hitler's personal authority. Metropolitan London was off limits. A boundary had been drawn around the outer perimeter of the capital, and within that boundary no Luftwaffe ordnance was to fall. Hitler's reasoning was never fully articulated, even in conversations closest to the decision. Several interpretations circulated among those who thought seriously about it. He may have intended to preserve London for a ceremonial occasion, to enter the unconquered capital in triumph once the campaign concluded, moving through streets whose monuments bore no scars. He may have calculated that destroying a city so deeply woven into the sympathies of the neutral world would produce an adverse impression serving no strategic purpose, or he may have concluded simply that reducing London to rubble would yield no tactical advantage worth the propaganda cost. Whatever the private reasoning, the prohibition was firm. Among those within Luftwaffe planning circles who regarded civilian morale as a weapon, there were advocates for a different approach. They pointed to Warsaw, where sustained bombardment had eventually brought the population to a point that military resistance alone could not have reached. Göring was unmoved. He turned the question back on those who advanced it. Would the people of Berlin submit under sustained terror bombing? He believed they would not, and he had no reason to think Londoners would respond differently. The prohibition suited his own instinct as well as it satisfied Hitler's order. In Britain, the picture carried its own quiet paradox. There were those in positions of real authority who had been hoping, in the privacy of their own thinking, for precisely the thing that Göring and Hitler had ruled out. Churchill had spent certain evenings in the garden of Downing Street, listening to the sound of aircraft engines passing overhead and to the distant concussions of bombs falling on the outer reaches of the city. A story circulated, whether entirely accurate or not, that he raised his hands toward the sky on such evenings and urged the bombers toward the center. His understanding was international in character. The image of London burning would move opinion in the United States in ways that careful diplomatic persuasion could never match. Dowding's interest in seeing the Luftwaffe shift toward the capital was rooted in something more immediate. If the assaults on Fighter Command sector stations continued at their current rate, London's air defences would be dismantled before the city was ever directly struck. A diversion of the Luftwaffe's weight toward London, whatever its cost to the city, would relieve the pressure on the airfields being steadily destroyed and give Fighter Command space to recover. Neither man's calculation was anywhere near being realized. Hitler held firmly to his prohibition. And then, on the night of August the 24th, something happened that neither side had planned. Some 170 Luftwaffe bombers swept in that night along a route extending from Kent northward towards Scotland. Among the assigned targets were aircraft factories at Rochester and Kingston along the Thames, and oil storage facilities at Thameshaven, 15 miles east of London. Lead planes equipped with radio navigation gear served as pathfinders for the formations behind them. In the press of the approach, 2 planes lost sight of their pathfinders. They flew on into thickening anti-aircraft fire, uncertain of their position. Realizing at last that they had strayed well beyond their intended course, the 2 pilots made the decision the situation appeared to demand. They released their bombs, turned east, and flew for home. They were over London when the bombs fell. 2 struck near the heart of the city, destroying the ancient church of St. Giles in Cripplegate and tearing John Milton's statue from its base in a nearby square. The rest came down across the northern and eastern boroughs: Islington, Finchley, Stepney, Tottenham, Bethnal Green, among streets and houses where ordinary people were ending an ordinary evening, coming out of pubs at closing time, making their way home through the mild August dark. Even at the time, there was little genuine uncertainty about what had happened. Analysis of the Luftwaffe's attack programs in the days that followed confirmed it. No raids on London had been ordered for that night. The targets assigned to the operation had been industrial and aeronautical, carefully plotted and clearly communicated. 2 pilots had become lost, had made a desperate and entirely human decision under pressure, and had by chance released their loads over one of the most consequential cities in the world. Their error was the kind that can never be fully planned for, born of exhaustion, of darkness, of an anti-aircraft barrage that had scattered their sense of position until only instinct and urgency remained. Churchill chose to read the incident as something other than an accident. He convened a meeting of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, and a decision followed without significant delay. An order went to RAF Bomber Command, and from there to a wing of Hampden aircraft based in Norfolk on England's eastern coast. In the previous week, these aircraft had been sent over German territory carrying propaganda leaflets rather than bombs, printed appeals to the German people, warning them that the war their government had started would continue for as long as that government remained in power. It was a restrained kind of warfare, suited to a moment when restraint still held some strategic logic. That moment had now passed. The wing's commander, John Oxley, was instructed to load his aircraft for a strike. The target was Berlin. Göring had, at various points in the months before, given a characteristically bold assurance to the German people. Enemy bombers would never reach the German capital. The remark had acquired additional weight from the addendum he attached to it. If they ever did penetrate to Berlin, he had told his audience with a laugh, the German people could feel free to call him by an entirely different name. On the night of August the 25th, RAF Hamdens flew over the Berlin suburb of Ruhleben. The physical damage they caused was limited. The damage to Göring's credibility and to the settled confidence with which the German public had been encouraged to regard the security of their capital was considerably harder to assess and far harder to repair. Göring gave his assurances immediately. There would be no further such attacks. Churchill responded by instructing Bomber Command to continue. Over the following nights, additional strikes against Berlin took place. Each one renewed a promise that Göring found himself unable to honor, and together they drove Hitler toward a decision that had been gathering pressure beneath his composure for weeks. On the 4th of September, Hitler addressed a mass gathering at the Sportspalast in Berlin. He was in a state of open belligerence, and he gave it full expression. He described the British bombing campaign as Churchill's personal invention, conducted against German cities, he said, because the RAF lacked the capacity to operate over Germany in daylight. The patience of the Reich, however, was finite. When the British dropped thousands of kilograms on German cities, Germany would respond in one raid with hundreds of thousands. He had heard the British asking among themselves why he had waited. He urged them to be calm. He was coming. The hour would arrive when one side would break, and it would not be National Socialist Germany. Göring needed nothing further. He departed for northern France the following morning on his private train. On a railway siding between Calais and Boulogne, he hosted a banquet for his air fleet commanders, the finest French wines and food his staff could arrange. From this moment forward, he told them, he was taking personal command of the campaign. A toast was raised to victory. 12 hours later, on the afternoon of Saturday the 7th of September, Göring stood once more at the observation post on Cap Gris-Nez. His expression was one of undisguised excitement, flushed and animated. Above his head, wave upon wave of Luftwaffe bombers crossed the narrow strip of the Channel. Their destination was London, the city Hitler had for weeks held off limits, and that provocation had now released. The Reich Marshal was exhilarated by the scale of what he had set in motion, and the city waiting below those pale chalk cliffs was about to learn, with great and terrible clarity, what it meant to become a target. At 4 o'clock on the afternoon of September the 7th, Dowding was at his desk in Bentley Priory when Pilot Officer Wright came through the door. The day outside was warm and still, but the information Wright carried had a different quality entirely. Several formations of 20 or more aircraft were building over Calais. This, he said quietly, looked like a significant one. The two men moved to the balcony above the operations room. Below them, young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, in headphones dressed in blue, moved coloured blocks across the great map of the Channel and southern England with long rods, each adjustment reflecting fresh intelligence arriving from radar stations along the coast. The movements were continuous and precise, and the map had the quality of something written in real time. The raid assembling on the table was unlike anything the plotting boards had previously shown. Some 250 bombers and 500 fighters were already crossing the channel, with more forming over France behind them. As Dowding watched, a realization settled over him he would later describe as resembling a sudden wound, a premonition arriving before his reasoning had time to frame it. Every previous major Luftwaffe raid, on reaching the English coast, had divided into smaller formations bound for different targets. Fighter Command's entire interception system was built around that pattern. This time, the formations held together and came on as a single mass. When Wright observed quietly that the enemy did not appear to be splitting up, Dowding had already arrived at the same thought. Around 150 bombers drove upriver along the Thames toward London. Woolwich Arsenal was struck first, the hits sending columns of fire and smoke rising with something close to volcanic force. Then the vast complex of the city's docklands absorbed the full weight of the remaining formations. Victoria and Albert docks, the West India Dock, the commercial docks. Ships went down at their moorings. Cranes toppled into the water. Spilled oil caught fire on the river's surface. The warehouses through which the city was supplied from the outside world were burning. The RAF fought back with everything available. Park sent every 11 Group aircraft into the air. Lee Mallory's squadrons were ordered in as well, and fighters from both groups pressed through the protective layers of Messerschmitts and drove toward the bomber formations with the determination of men who had been fighting at the edge of their capacity for weeks. Londoners watching from below took some comfort from the sight of stricken German aircraft falling through the columns of smoke. But the defense had come too late. The damage to the docklands and the residential streets of the East End, Silvertown, Canning Town, Limehouse, Barking, Poplar, Millwall, had been done before the intercepting fighters could reach them. 400 people were dead, thousands more injured, and a great number of residents had gathered what they could carry and were moving away from the burning streets, correctly expecting the night would bring more. It did. The fires served as beacons for the night bombers that followed. For 7 consecutive days and nights the raids continued. 2,000 more Londoners died in that week. More than 10,000 were wounded or buried in rubble. And yet, within the arithmetic of the larger battle, something unexpected was quietly occurring. The Luftwaffe's concentration on London had lifted the sustained pressure from Fighter Command sector stations and supply infrastructure. The airfields had space to recover. The RAF now knew where the bombers were going, and knowing could be waiting. On the 15th of September, Göring ordered the largest attack yet mounted against the capital. Around 400 bombers and 700 fighters approached in successive waves. From the moment they crossed the English coast, Fighter Command met them at maximum strength, nearly 300 aircraft engaging with an intensity the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. The fighting lasted through most of the day. In one of its final engagements, a Hurricane pilot named Sergeant R.T. Holmes struck 2 Dorniers over London's West End, knocking part of a wing from one and breaking the other apart in the air. Holmes himself parachuted from his damaged machine and came to earth in a dustbin on the King's Road in Chelsea. The Air Ministry announced that 185 German aircraft had been destroyed. The figure established later was 56, with 26 RAF aircraft lost in return. The day had not delivered the decisive blow Göring had promised. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely and instructed his generals to seek other means of bringing Britain to terms. The island kingdom remained unbroken,